Hello, this is Lady B, and today I'm doing a sewing project. Now, this is a dress I bought online, and as we do these days since COVID, and I purchased it, and based on the pictures I saw online, I thought it would have a cut similar to what I have here on my shirt. But as you can tell by how I've hung it on the hanger, what I thought were the shoulder seams is actually a drop shoulder. So if you can see, I don't know how well it shows, there's a curve here that comes, then you have the drop shoulder seam, and then it has a straight line to the V. Now this resulted in it being much lower than I expected, and while it was sort of okay, when I tried it on, when I actually started wearing it, I found that it did not stay modest. Now, it's very, very hard these days to buy dresses with modest necklines. You can find them, but most of them do have a lower neckline. So for those of us who like a little higher neckline, I thought this could be a nice little tutorial on one of the ways you can raise the neckline and make it perhaps look like it came with the dress. So I went out and purchased this fabric. It's a sheer fabric similar to what they use for prom dresses. And you think, oh, that's too sheer, that's not going to cover anything up. Well, it will when I'm done with it. I only had the one choice of red. Fortunately, it looks pretty good next to this red. And it's a shade darker, but so are my shoes I bought to go with it. So this is not going to be patterning. This is just going to be pinning it right on the dress form and working things out. Now I'm going to do a double V on it. So I need 4 pieces, 2 of them larger than the others. This is way more fabric than I need. But since I'm just free-forming this, I'm going to hold this up. If you can see, let me see if you can see that better. Hold this up, make sure I have plenty of extra inches on either side. And that is my size I want for a piece. So, there's the first piece. And then to this, it looks like if I wanted to, I could get 4 pieces out of this. But I don't know if I need that much. So I'm going to fold this over. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take pieces, I'm going to fold them over, and then I'm going to pin them in place. Now looking at this, for at least the first one, I think I only need half of this. So I have an iron over here. This should be nice and hot. Yep. So I'm just going to spray that and just iron it, fold it in half and then iron it. And this will just make it easy for me to know where to cut this in half. All right, scissors. Now normally I don't use blue. I actually have an allergy to blue dyes, but I've lost my stuff that's not blue. So if I start itching my fingers, you'll know why. So now that I've creased that, I'll cut along the crease. And there's a couple of different ways to, when you get into sewing, there's a couple of different ways to pattern. One of them is to obviously work with a pattern that someone has made. One of them is to do what's called flat patterning, and with flat patterning you take measurements and you make your own patterns from those measurements. And then the last way to do it is to do it usually on a dress form, but right on whatever it is that you are doing. And that's what we're doing here. And sometimes it's just the measurements and everything just get in the way. There's no reason for them. That isn't the straightest thing I ever ironed. Let's see. That should be okay though. Let's do the next one. This style of doing it right on the form though is the reason why people who are really serious about making their own clothes tend to make or buy a mannequin to their size so that they can just fit things right on the mannequin and they know they will be the right size. There we go. So I have 2 of them that have been folded over. And now I have some pins here and I'm literally just going to pin it into place on the dress. So starting with this side so you can see it a little better, I want to have it come up. Now there's a seam here, and then after this, as I mentioned, there's a drop shoulder seam, and then after the drop shoulder seam, it curves. So the idea is I'm going to bring it from this seam so that it looks like it was intentional to where I want it to be here. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is pin it in place on that seam. Like that. And then down here. And this is where I'm deciding just how far over I want. Now since I'm doing a double, if I was just doing a single, and I could just do a single, but I like multiples. And by doing a double, it makes it look kind of like this tuliping effect. And since I'm doing a double and I want my total to come up to about there, I wanted about half of that. So this first one I want only right here. That is too far down. Right there. And then I'm going to drop another one in the middle here, making sure I have it where I want it. Try and keeping this all even. All right, so there's my first one from here to here. I don't know how well you can see that. And now I'm going to take my next one and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. All right, so I have my first one in here. Now I need my second. This is so very simple. So once again, want it to overlap a little bit, just to make sure I have plenty. So about right here. And again, I don't need this full width. So I could have actually gotten half of this, which I knew when I went to the store, but I wanted to make sure I had enough. So I got twice the width. So I will just roll this up, this extra fabric up, and I'll put it in my craft drawer for the next time I need some. for something or other. And then once again. All right. So 2 more pieces exactly the same. And I'm going to be pinning these in place too, but I'm going to be having them come out further. So, first side, once again, I tuck it in, bring it to right where that seam is. And there I go, like that. I'll drop a pin in there. Now I don't need this first pin. And make sure this is about, on this one I can either have it double what it was before, or I can have it, in design it's often a good idea to break things into thirds and have something between a half and a third. So if I do it exactly the same, it will work, but it looks better if I tuck it just a little bit smaller than the first one. So that's what I'm going to do. So this first fold creates a center line up it that is just past the half mark or just under the half mark. In this case, it will be just past the half mark. So, right there. Yeah, that's good. And then straighten those up. And this time I'm going to drop 2 pins going up. Give me a little more control here. There we go. Take this pin out. Now, by layering these, this very corner here, which is where it's just too low, now has 4 layers of this sheer fabric. It actually will have 8 if you count this other side too, in the very, very, very bottom, which is perfect for what I'm looking for. So even though it's a very sheer fabric, with all the layers, it will be quite opaque. So we check that, see if that looks the same side to side. That's good enough. And I'm going to bring this closer to the camera so you can see better what I've done here. So you can see this double here. Now, the next step to this is I have to turn the dress inside out. And you'll be thinking, why did you do that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because I need to mark where my actual seams are going to go on what I have just pinned. So, 1 second. Get the zipper back up so it's nice and stable. There we go. So this is what it looks like on the inside. And now you need either some chalk or one of these. This is a water-soluble dressmaking pencil. You can pick these up at any store that sells fabric. It's for marking on fabric. And what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to mark my seams on this side where it wouldn't show anyway, but it's better to have something water soluble. But I'm going to mark where this shoulder seam is. I'm going to mark where the actual seam on the dress is, where the neckline is, and where this, on the outside, it just looks like a straight seam with this extra sewn line around it. But on the inside, there's this bias tape. And that gives me something to sew, and it'll have to be hand sewn, but it gives me something to sew this to without it showing on the other side. So I need to mark where both sides of that is. And that's going to take a few minutes. So, now with 4 layers of this fabric, I can't see through this, but the bias tape is just thick enough I can feel where it is. So as I go down and mark this, I'm literally just marking on the other side of the bias tape. All right, so I've now marked shoulder seams and where the underside of that bias tape is. Now I need to pin these to each other on the inside so I can remove the pins pinning it to the dress, because I don't want that to come apart. So I'm going to drop some pins in that don't catch the dress. And if you're thinking these pins are large, they are. They're actually quilting pins. As I get older, I find I like larger pins, even for sewing. Sometimes when I'm doing really fine work, sewing work, I'll still use the smaller pins. For just about everything else, I use these. I haven't lost any yet. There we go. So now I can remove the pins holding it to the dress. There we do. So there's my fabric with my neckline. And on this side, you can see where I've drawn that line. And now it's time to sew. Okay. So I have thread my bobbin and my thread on my machine. And I'm going to do some testing on this section. I'm going to end up cutting off to check what tension I should have and whether I even have the right needle, whether this needle will work. The needle's definitely working. Tension is good. I think I want my length a little shorter. Test number 2. Maybe somewhere in the middle. Always, always, always test before you actually sew on your finished, what's supposed to be your finished product. There we go. Let's try. 3. Yep, that's what I want. So my length is, on this machine, 1.5. Now this is a Singer Merit 8834. I've had this for a long time. My mother was a seamstress. That's what she got her degree in. And so when, not only did she make sure that all of her daughters could sew, when we graduated from high school, where some kids would get cars or trips to Europe, she bought us sewing machines. So I've had this since I turned 18. All right, so if you can see, I don't know how well it's showing up, but we have this line I drew. And what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to sew a line across here, and then I'm going to sew down that line and then back up to the other side to secure it together. Once I've done that, I can take these pins out. Which I better have somewhere to put them. All right. So drop a needle, hold the pin. All right. Stitch one across the top. Good and secure. Awesome. And now down the line. Anytime you're starting a stitch on a machine, you always back stitch and then go forward again in order to secure it. Now I'm at the V, so I raise the foot, drop a couple stitches across, one too far there, raise the foot, drop it, there we go, this pin can come out. All right. Trimming off the excess thread. Always trim your excess thread when you have a moment, because if you sew over it and you have some excess thread, it can get pulled down into the machine and get tangled, and then you waste a lot of time fixing it. All right. I don't think I got that quite even. All right. So that's what I have so far. You can see it's kind of hard to see because of it's so shiny. So now I want to sew a reinforcing stitch because material like this frays really easy. It's also really stiff, and I don't want this unfinished edge next to my skin. So my next step is to sew a secondary line on one side and to zigzag between them in order to reinforce the seam. And I think I want to get the dress and check how it looks really quick. So here's my dress, and here's my V. And all right, I'm happy with that. So we move forward. So reinforce the stitch. I'm going to move my needle over to the right, and then I'm going to measure the width of the channel I'm making by running the stitch I've already made along the side of the foot. And this time, I'm not doing it separate. I'm going to actually go around each of these corners. There we go. And do one long continuous stitch around the whole thing. just a little bit further. That was too far. Let's back that up. This is fine. I wanted to reinforce the corner anyway. That will do. There we go. There we go. There we go. So I now have two lines. Maybe I can focus on it. I don't know if that's showing up with how shiny this fabric is, but I have two lines here. I wonder how far apart those actually are. Let's see. And that is 1/4 inch. One 1/4 to 3/8, which is what I wanted, so I did correctly. Now I'm going to move my needle back to the middle, and after I clean up my threads, I am going to I'm going to zigzag, and I'm going to zigzag close to the outer, this outer line here. All right. Once again, I will be starting. Ooh, I need a test. Remember what I said, always test. So, let's see how wide I want this zag to be. I need it closer together too. That is not far enough. Go to a 3. That is probably what I'm looking for. Let's try it on a 2 again with the skinnier length. No, I definitely want a 3. All right. So there's my test. And what I'm looking for, this fabric's really bad for showing this. You red on red thread, of course, makes it so it doesn't, so it disappears when it's on the, but it makes it hard for you to see. If you can see this, I have the different widths here. And what I'm trying to do is I want a width that doesn't go much past halfway. I want to drop the stitch of that as close to this outer line as possible, but I want a space between almost half of this channel between the zigzag and this one. 2 was too small, so we're going to a width of 3. And let's see, right there, yes. And like I said, this is to reinforce the seam, because I'm going to be trimming the fabric. Now, if you have a serger, the serger just does this automatically. This is how you imitate that serger seam. On a standard sewing machine. That's good. Reinforce the V and back around. Now, when I'm sewing cottons and more natural fabrics, I'll just zip through it, but with this being, this is a completely man-made fabric. It is an artificial thread, and I'm a little more, they tend to be more slippery, and so I'm a little more careful when I'm sewing with it. There we go. And now that I've reinforced that seam, I can cut away all this extra. And you make sure not to cut any of the thread that you sewed, the sewn thread, but you do cut as close to the stitch, you know, within like a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch of the stitch. But here we go. So now I could put this in like this, but I don't like having these edges touching my skin. So the next step is I'm going to iron, and the reason I left this channel between in here is I'm going to iron this over, creating this effect right here. And that is what I will be sewing through when I'm finished sewing. I'm actually going to be ironing it to the right side, which means this is the side that will be showing through the dress. Right here, if you see, like this. And I'm going to iron it inward like this, so that when I sew it onto the dress, onto the bias tape, this will be covered. This seam will be inside this new stitch. So it will be hidden, and there won't be any raw edges at all that will touch my skin of this fabric. So now I need to go iron it. I just have to do this by hand. And be careful not to burn myself. And you can see how where I've cut it, it's fraying. This is why we reinforced the seam the way I did. Is that fraying is not our friend. And that zigzag with the second line will prevent that. Looks good. I'm quite happy with that. And there we go. That only step left now is to sew it in. And this has to be done by hand at this point because it's being added afterwards with the type of dress it is. If I want to hide that stitch, I have to do it by hand. So that's going to take a little while. But that's where we are next. It's done. Now, you can see how it looks right there. So, I'm not sure how well it showed on the time lapse. So, I wanted to try and show you what I've done here. If you look on the inside, you can see my stitches here. Now, I am not very good at hand sewing. In fact, I'd say I'm pretty, it doesn't matter how much I practice it, I can't keep the stitches even. Focus. As a result, when I do hand sewing, I try to hide it as much as possible. So what I've done here is, you can see where that first stitch was where I actually sewed it. And that was the stitch I marked with the dressmaker pencil to show the underside, this bottom of this, which is the bias tape. I marked it along the bottom of this bias tape here. So I sewed it through in a running stitch through the bottom of the bias tape and then up through the fabric where that first seam was, making sure to get the part that had been ironed over. So, and then remember I have the seam inside, so then that made it so that that frayed stuff was just in here, was just right there. So then I also had to sew, got this turned around now, I also had to sew another running stitch, and this one I sewed along the top of the bias on the inside of the collar, and then through just one layer, sometimes two, of the fabric that is this 4 layers. So there it is, sewed, hand sewn, inside and out, here and here, into the collar. Shall we see how it turned out? And there we go. It's the dress with the V-neck. And you can see why I wanted to raise it. Before it was clear down here. Now it's here. And this red is the same color as my shoes. Right there, so you can see exact same shade. So that together they make a complete outfit. And that's it. That took about probably 5 hours. Most of that was the hand sewing. So, ta-da. I'm just going to keep twirling because I just love it. I'm so very, very, very happy with it. So there we go. Raising a V neckline with a double V in a sheer fabric for a more modest neckline. This is Lady B signing off. Until next time. We'll see you then. And they use the bias tape because it will go around a curve without any bunching. If you're not familiar with bias tape, it is a wonderful thing when it comes to things like this. It's fabric that has literally been cut on the bias, which means the diagonal in the fabric. Because if you look at the fabric, you pull with these straight weave fabrics, if you pull this way, it doesn't have any give. And if you pull this way, it doesn't have any give. But if you pull on the diagonal, it has give. It will move. And so what this means is if you take pieces of fabric, cut on that diagonal, you can sew around curves and it won't bunch. It will stretch to meet the curve. So the bias tape in the dress even though this curves, there is no, the bias tape will curve with the curve.